Hello, everyone. I am Corey Andrew Powell, and I'm thrilled to have an extraordinary guest with me today whose relentless pursuit of justice has not only changed the narrative around one of the most significant disasters in American history, but also inspired countless others to stand up and make a difference as well. Now, after Hurricane Katrina and the levee failures in New Orleans, Sandy Rosenthal founded levees.org, a nonprofit organization with 25,000 supporters nationwide. Her groundbreaking book, Words Whispered in Water, reveals how she exposed the Army Corps of Engineers' role in the levee breach disaster. Sorry, that's a mouthful, but it's a really important thing she did there. And I'm so happy to welcome Sandy to Motivational Mondays. Welcome.
I'm delighted to be here. Thank you.
It's my pleasure. And first, what I wanted to tell you, the first thing, of course, as I'm reading your story and all the stuff you're doing, I mean, I'm sure you get the Aaron Brockovich all the time, right? I mean, that's not. Have you heard that one before a few times?
We are really very, very similar in that we were both women with no special skills, no special training that stood up
Hmm.
against a powerful force and didn't give up and won.
Yeah, no, and it's an amazing thing too. And so just to take it back to that, just as I mentioned, you are the founder of levees.org. So if you can share with us the moment that you decided to start the organization, because it's not just about, oh, there was a disaster and then you just kind of all of a sudden did it. There was something that ignited you making this movement a mission for you. So please share how that happened.
There was definitely an ignition, and that happened over a conversation that became very heated.
Mm,
And I was very agitated. I had been through the disaster, and actually, it better called a catastrophe,
yeah.
and lived through it, fortunately. And I was in a town about 2 hours away from New Orleans and talking to a man, a resident of the town of Alexandria. And
Hmm.
I started to explain to him that the flooding of New Orleans was not due to Mother Nature, it was due to engineering failure, and it was the fault of the federal government.
Mm.
Well, he told me, no, no, he told me I'm wrong, that Katrina was a huge storm, and that people like me who'd lost everything didn't deserve any help from the government, and we shouldn't have been living there in the first place.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, that actually happened.
That's
And
absurd. Yeah.
I knew that day that something needed to be done, because if
Mhm.
there were people out there with this attitude, we knew it was going to be all over for us in New Orleans. I mean, how
Mm.
are we going to survive with people when people had that wrong idea in their head? This, by the way, was about 6 weeks after the flood.
Yeah. Because
So
it was,
that was the ignition. That was the
yeah.
ignition.
Yeah, because people don't I mean, I remember, and people who witnessed seeing it, of course. This was a long thing. I mean, there was the initial storm and the levee breaking and the whole city getting flooded. But right, there's the aftermath of which was like just a banquet of failures on many fronts, if you will, including the disaster relief and the rescue efforts. I mean, it just was one thing after the other. So what was it that made you realize, though, that there was something more than just Mother Nature at play?
Well, I was fortunate. I didn't lose my home. I didn't lose any family members. And so uh, I was in an unusual position that I could be listening to the radio and watching the news and reading whatever I could get my hands on. And I very quickly figured out that the storylines weren't making sense.
Mm,
I figured out pretty soon. I learned that these levees are designed and built by the federal government, and that the local officials maintain them. Okay, these levees are huge. Okay, we have 300 miles of levees,
mm,
and I thought to myself, it wasn't making sense. Why are we, the people of New Orleans, being blamed for this flooding when they're designed and built by the Army Corps of Engineers? And the more questions I asked, the more pushback I got, which was a signal to me that I'm irritating people by asking these questions.
mm.
And so the book goes into way more detail about this. But when I got pushback from asking questions, that's when I realized I'm either exactly right or certainly on the right path.
Mm. Yeah, it's just kind of scary though, because at that same time, I mean, not like I'm accusing the government of anything, but there's a lot of people who would like to keep stuff like that quiet. So they could make your life very uncomfortable. I mean, were you ever nervous or afraid of like, if I start to push or poke the bear too much, what would that mean for even my personal safety or my life in general going forward? What were the concerns?
Well, the answer to that is yes. I actually had to sit down and have a conversation with myself and realize that by continuing to publicly state that the federal government was responsible for this
Mm,
disaster, that I was putting myself in danger. I mean,
hmm
the federal government has deep pockets
mm, yeah.
and can and spend a lot of money, hire lots of people. And I actually started looking around, wondering if I was being followed. And in fact, as time went on, I was followed at every event that I ever put on. It turned up that the Army Corps had plants, had people there to record everything that was stated, record, take videos, etc., and bring them back to headquarters. And all of that's in
Gosh,
my book.
my
Did I?
gosh.
But I made the converse. I actually made the decision. I was 48 years old, and I said to myself, well, I've lived a good life. And if I get put away because of trying to speak out for the public, well, be that I'm ready to make that decision. And I'm still here.
Yeah, thank goodness. Because, as you were telling that story, I'm picturing it. And, it's like I'm seeing like almost like a John Grisham novel, when you're telling the story and they're kind of planting people and, recording you and taking it back to headquarters. That's some very serious stuff. So, of course, then that leads me to ask, what were some of the shocking discoveries you made during the investigation?
Some of the shocking discoveries. How
Mm,
it took a while to figure out the truth. As again, the Army Corps had deep pockets and plenty of money, and they spent millions of dollars fooling the American public and fooling Congress and doing things to harass me and to get me to shut up.
mm,
Um, so let me see the some of the I'll tell you one the first thing we did is using back end tools available to any amateur blogger. I figured out that the people that were harassing me online, I could look at the IP address. And
mm.
for those of you, the listeners who don't know what an IP address is, it's basically caller ID for computers.
Yeah, yeah.
And looking at the IP addresses, I figured out that it was the Army Corps was harassing me and saying vicious things to me online about me and my family and my supporters. So I
Mm,
called a local news WWL-TV, a news source, a TV, and told them what I'd found, and they did a big story about it.
mm,
Now, and they were caught. They were absolutely doing this. And the amazing thing is, even though it's not illegal in this country, it's not illegal for the Army Corps to do that. It's very embarrassing that they were
hmm
caught. It's
Right.
very embarrassing that they were caught doing it, and the damage done, the Army Corps to this day still hasn't recovered from that.
So that was,
Using
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to add that they were using government computers
Okay, yes.
to harass civilians.
hmm Right. Because that was my next question. Because if you were able to trace the IP, then it would have gone back to a .gov email address, basically, or or
IP
.gov
address.
IP address,
Yeah.
right? Computer, so you can tell
They-
exactly where it's coming from.
right. Right.
Mm.
And they it was interesting. They were spying on me, or they thought they were. It turned up I could see exactly who they were. It was the back in it was the Wild West days when the idea of leaving comments on stories online was a brand new thing and everyone did it
hmm
anonymously. You might remember that. It was all
Mm.
anonymous back in the beginning, and that's not
Yeah.
allowed anymore. And the
hmm
reason was it could be abused, like by the Army Corps of Engineers.
Sure, sure. Or now we see all the very politically divisive time, death threats to political rivals and all kinds of craziness that thank God we can now, in most cases, figure out where that stuff is coming from. So the great part about your story, though, is it does inspire just sort of like the citizen activism component, although yours was very extreme in this regard. But when it comes to the what the government was supposed to do with these levees. Your book, well, your findings sort of call into question other projects when I think about it. Like, because the Army Corps of Engineers, they're like responsible for like a lot of other stuff too. Like, not that's just one thing. So, did you also then start to question, well, like, what else have they built that might be about to collapse? If we're not careful, what'd you uncover there?
Well, certainly, I questioned it. I know I'm certain that all your listeners are familiar with the Chernobyl disaster.
Hmm.
And if any of your listeners have watched any documentaries or movies about it, what the Russians did was they cut corners uh, and did things cheaply on the cheap to save money, and that's why Chernobyl was the disaster that it was. The exact same reason that the levees in New Orleans broke, the Army Corps of Engineers was trying to save money.
Hmm.
And that's all in my book. I won't go into how they did that, but
Yeah.
they they uh they figured out they could save up 100 million by short sheeting the steel sheet pilings.
Mm.
Okay, it's the steel that you drive into the ground. $100 million was saved. Well, when the levees broke, it cost $200 billion to the American people.
Mm.
The
Mm.
damages, not to mention the loss of life.
Yeah.
The Army Corps was saving money. Now, is there anything wrong with trying to save money? No, we all do it every day. We're all
Hmm.
looking for sales every day. We're all looking for ways to save money every day. That wasn't the Army Corps' big mistake. The big mistake was they tried to cover it up.
Hmm. Yeah.
And it's the same is true with Chernobyl.
Mm.
And so yes, we should look carefully whenever we see a disaster. The most recent disaster was what the cause of life of six people was the bridge in
Hmm.
Baltimore
Yeah.
at the
Yeah.
most recent disaster. And I'm there's no doubt in my mind that very soon it's going to come out that mistakes were made, that the systems designed to prevent this was somehow failed, and
Hmm.
it's all going to come out very soon. It's just a matter of time.
It's interesting you bring that up because the conversation that I've heard a lot when this incident happened with the bridge is that how at this stage in our history does a bridge where that much cargo comes back and forth not already have a mechanism in place in which it opens to let that level of size, vessels go by. And it's like, it's almost such an antiquated bridge to have in the water at this stage, knowing what kind of cargo comes and goes through that port. It's just, um, it does call into question a lot of the decisions we make when we send aid to other countries, which I think is great, but you kind of have to take care of home too, it would seem. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
It seems simple to me what you're saying. I'm also going to let your listeners in on a little secret. I have close conversations with top engineers, and it turned up that a disaster like this happened only 20 years ago,
Mhm.
and the exact same thing happened. And because of that disaster 20 years ago, I can't remember where the bridge was. I'll think of it as soon as we sign off. But but because of that disaster 20 years ago, information went out. You need to do this, 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 and this with your bridges to make sure that you don't get a similar disaster.
Mm,
And it turned up that the Baltimore Bridge actually had instructions on how to do that, but they never got done.
right,
They never
right.
got done. And now, boom, the exact same thing that happened 20 years ago happened again.
Hmm.
So there you go. Why it wasn't done, not enough people raised the alarm, I suppose.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, and I would argue probably it was because there was a budget involved, there was money involved, and they were, I mean, I don't know for sure, but there's a pattern there when it comes to cutting corners, and then you end up having to pay exponentially more than if you had just paid for it in the first place. Now, with this sort of mission, if you will, of really bucking up against the system and, really not knowing what's going to happen if you kind of make certain people angry. Were there some difficult days where you were like, okay, I need to stop this? Like, I don't think I can go forward anymore. It's becoming more and more difficult. Or did you always just push through?
There were many days that I thought to myself, this is much harder than I thought it would be. It's taking longer than I thought it would take. The project is bigger than I thought it was going to be. And I had many, many days like that. I just
Hmm.
kept reminding myself that I was one of the lucky ones. All I had to do was look around me, and immediately I could see someone that lost a loved one or lost their house. Or even if you didn't lose your house, you might have lost your job because
Hmm.
your business was flooded or the people
Yeah.
you worked for flooded. So it was not hard for me to be reminded of why I was doing this work. In the beginning, it was the most hard because it took a long time to get people on my side. It just so happened that the Army Corps of Engineers in the town of New Orleans is one of the biggest employers.
Mm.
Well, so one of the reasons people were nervous about supporting me is they didn't want their bosses to be angry at them.
Mm.
They were watching their pocketbook, so to
Yeah.
speak. It was a
Yeah.
financial reason not to support me. So that made it very difficult for me. There were not many people in New Orleans. Fortunately, I was able to get a lot of support nationwide. Keep in mind that a lot of people that were flooded in New Orleans, unfortunately, ended up being displaced
Hmm. Yeah.
and were literally all over the country. And many of them were never able to come home, which is very sad to me.
Yeah. And to go back to what you were saying, where the first gentleman you spoke to made the comment about it was all of your fault for living there. It's very strange because I hear that a lot when it comes to natural disasters, like especially during like tornado season. You hear people make those comments often, and those comments are quite moronic, quite honestly, because people live where they live, and we rely on certain services and government help and protections. We hope they'll be there to help us through those situations. But you look at that as almost victim blaming in a way, then, would you not?
Oh, the victim blaming was relentless after the flooding, and something else that very few people understand is the concept of evacuating.
Mm,
Well, why don't you just evacuate? Oh, just evacuate.
right.
First of all, for some people, it's okay that if you've got a car and credit cards and road
Mm,
experience and people you can go visit, sure, just evacuate. But what if you don't have those things?
right.
And in the city of New Orleans, about 100,000 people didn't have those things.
Hmm.
Also, a large number of the people who didn't evacuate are the elderly.
Mm,
Books are written on the subject. The
yeah.
elderly are stubborn.
Hmm.
They just are. It is very difficult to get an elderly person out of their apartment or out of their home when you've got a Category 5 storm coming straight for your house.
Yeah.
Uh, Books are written on the subject.
Hmm.
But it's our responsibility as their children to get them out of their houses, even if you have to physically carry them.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
but again, evacuation is totally misunderstood. There was and here's a great example. I'll leave you with this. The city of Houston looked down their nose at us when a hurricane was bearing on Houston, and their government said, "Well, we'll show New Orleans how to evacuate." And their evacuation was a massive failure,
Mm,
massive
yeah.
failure. And some of your listeners may remember of a bus filled with nursing home residents
Oh, I
that
remember that.
actually that and it's a very sad story, but with a very terrible ending. But evacuations are deadly to a
Hmm.
lot of people.
Yeah.
So again, evacuations misunderstood. It's often better to shelter in place, but you need to be able to rely on those safeguards to protect you, like for the
Hmm.
tornadoes, for the forest fires, and for hurricanes.
Yeah. And you mentioned the danger of the evacuation. Many people even decide to evacuate too late, and then they find themselves right in the eye of a storm, or like then they get trapped in like a burning, forest fire where they have no way out because they didn't even heed the warning and evacuate when they should have. There's all kinds of dynamics at play. But to follow up on what you mentioned about getting support across the country, you did manage to mobilize like 25,000 supporters eventually for your levees.org organization. So, um, did you do that? Did you just one by one reach out to different companies, or do you have a team, or how did that come to be?
That's a really good question. It started out with just 200 people, the old-fashioned way,
Mm,
by emailing people and saying, sign this petition and join our website. It started
mm,
out that way. And then one of the major ways we built a very large database is when we pushed for federal legislation for a true independent investigation of those levees. Would you believe there's never been an independent investigation of the levee breaches? You're
Mm.
not going to believe who was in charge of the investigation. The Army Corps of Engineers.
Yeah.
At the
Yeah.
time, at the time, I mean, of course, we were struggling. We were trying to figure out where we're going to live, how are my kids going to go to school, and where am I going
Hmm.
to get a job? So we were so busy dealing with the catastrophe that we didn't really have time to rise up and say, "Excuse me, you've got the Army Corps of Engineers investigating the levee failure."
Mm.
So there was never an independent investigation. So my little group of my little nonprofit, we pushed the legislation for that independent investigation. And
Mm.
with that, we got a lot of support nationwide. And that was probably our biggest builder of the big database that we have. It got up to as high as 20,000 with that. And then with each campaign we did, it grew and grew and grew until it was up to 25,000 total. Many of them were, excuse me, many of them were evacuees that used to
Mm.
live in New Orleans
Okay.
and had moved out, but not all of them. But by no means not
Hmm.
all of them. We had lots of support from even people that didn't live here.
Right. Well, I mean, I would imagine so because it was so highly televised. I mean, there's no way that you wouldn't have support because the entire country, well, the world, I mean,
The
the world
world.
saw it. Yeah, the world. And there were moments, I remember harrowing moments like when Anderson Cooper, that famous moment or infamous, if you will, where I think there was a city official and she was saying how everything's going great. And he was like, I'm standing next to a dead body with a sheet over it. Like that's been there for like 3 days. Like that's not going great. I mean, it was something that we had never seen before. And I imagine it was easy to probably get people who had watched that kind of stuff on board to say, we don't want this to happen again. And someone has to be held responsible. And you were described as like David taking on Goliath. So, I mean, if you were to try to advise someone to take on an organization that seemed like a powerful entity, what would you say to them now, knowing what you know?
Sure. Um, One of the things I've learned is that large organizations like the Army Corps of Engineers or like Conoco, big oil companies, big agriculture, big hog,
Mm,
all these large corporations have gotten so big that they have an arrogance to them, and they believe that they're invincible. They believe that it's not possible for the little guy, a nonprofit like mine, to make a difference, to matter
mhm,
to them. And that arrogance causes them to make big mistakes. For example, when I caught the Army Corps of Engineers red-handed harassing me online.
mhm,
And I did it again with free online tools available to any amateur. Okay.
mhm, yeah,
They make big mistakes. They
mhm,
always do. And if you just got to be watching for those mistakes, and when you see that mistake, jump on it.
mhm,
It's happened. Every person I've interviewed on my podcast, they all can give you examples of when the force that they were trying to get to change their ways made a mistake. They were jumped on it and put that out before the world. Something happened here recently. Entergy, which is a Fortune 500 company, was recently caught stacking a city council meeting with actors, with paid actors,
mm,
and they were caught doing this. They were caught. And again, it's not illegal in this country to do that. But if you're caught doing it,
mm,
the embarrassment to Entergy to this day, if anyone Googles Entergy, this incident with this scandal, just type in Entergy scandal, this is going to come right up of the paid actor scandal. So that's
mm.
what I would say, that the big guys are all highly beatable. And the second most important thing is I think of them as no different from the bully in the fourth grade playground.
Yes, uh-huh. Yeah.
They may be big, but they're not smarter. In fact, you are probably a lot smarter than they are.
Yeah, yeah, that's so funny because as you were saying that, the first thing I was thinking was it was like bullying, and typically the bully will come and just sort of be brawn and intimidation, and it would take someone to be a lot more cerebral, thoughtful, and go, okay, how are we going to counterbalance this? And that's where they go wrong because they're using intimidation very typically. And in your book, words whispered in water, which I love, a lot of W's there. You mention the Freedom of Information Act very prominently as something that's important and maybe Americans should really be more aware of it. So share your thoughts on why that's an important thing for Americans to know about.
Certainly, it's really what the Freedom of Information Act, or FOIA, is a really underutilized tool in my mind. The we as citizens have the right to request any information we want from the federal government and from local government, state governments as well. It has a little different name. It's called the PPA, the Public Records Request. Okay, but the FOIA, that's for federal. It's remarkable how much information you can get through a FOIA request, and some of it may not be what you asked for.
Mm,
And so it'll open up another can of worms that you didn't know about. I'll give you one great example. I wanted to know how many counties in the country live by levees, like New Orleans does.
mm,
I'd heard a number of 43%. 43. So I requested the data, said, where are these levees? And when I got my reply back, turned up it wasn't 43, it was 52,
mm.
more than
Okay.
50%. And then 10 years later, when I did another request, now it's up to 62.
Wow. Mm,
So 62%, nearly two-thirds of the American public lives in counties protected by levees.
mm,
And the reason that I was able to get my little pause on that data is because 15 years ago, I filed a request under the of Information Act, just asking our government, where are these levees? Now, where can we find them?
mm,
You, there are certain rules, but it's all you have to do is go online and type in, how do I file a request under FOIA? And there it is. Simple as can be. And
mm,
it's nothing to be afraid of. There's nothing wrong. Nothing should be scary. There's nothing wrong with filing a FOIA.
hmm. And how long did that take to for you to get that? I mean, how long in general? Like, I'll say I want to find out something, I go online or whatever, and I file to get it. Like, how long before the information is sent to you?
By law, the whatever entity you're writing to, in my case, it was the Army Corps of Engineers, they're required to acknowledge receipt of your request within 2 weeks,
Hmm.
and they're required to respond in six.
Okay, that's not that bad. I mean, that's give or take a little over a month or so that you get that information.
But here's a secret, though. That information is not published online. I just happen to know it.
Mm.
So I've just shared an important tidbit with your listeners.
Oh, I love it. Okay, yeah, we love little inside tips there. So if anyone really wants to make a FOIA request, now you can expect when you might get that response. This is really amazing information because there's so many people out there who are potentially that next big accidental activist, if you will, and they don't even know where to begin. So I love that, you're sharing that kind of information with us so people can really arm themselves with real information and data. And I have two more questions for you.
Sure.
One is, yes, looking back on all that you've accomplished and what you've done with this particular thing with New Orleans, is there anything that you would have done differently in your approach, or do you think, yeah, this is exactly how I should have done it? What do you think?
In the beginning, I often had people disguising their identities, telling me, "Oh, the true information will come out. You're going to find out in time that it was really local officials' fault in New Orleans. It's not the Army Corps' fault. The truth will all come out. You just need to wait. You just need to be patient." And I think I did wait. I did fear that I might be wrong.
Mm,
And and I think I hesitated a little more than I should have. Eventually I began to realize, wait a minute, even if I'm wrong, so what? I'm just an Ellen Brockovich.
mm,
I'm just Sandy Rosenthal. I said I'm not an engineer for a living. I'm not an attorney. I'm not making any money, certainly. And then I realized, you know what? I bet you that information is never going to come out. I'm going to keep at this. And I
mhm.
did.
Yeah.
But in the very beginning, I admit I was nervous.
Yes, and that is a wonderful closing sentiment from you, Sandy Rosenthal. Thank you so much for all you do, activist and author of the groundbreaking book, Words Whispered in Water. We really appreciate you being here today on Motivational Mondays. You rock. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.